As the second year of the war in Ukraine comes to a close, the situation is still unknown for both sides. Vladimir Putin keeps making propaganda for his own people in Russia, telling them that victory is just around the corner and that all their sacrifices were worth it. He threatens NATO, moves into Moldova, and says he will react to any threats with overwhelming force. At the same time, Russia is still facing harsh economic sanctions, its military supplies are running out, and it's getting harder and harder to get new soldiers for the war. This is because its citizens are avoiding the draft, and its private armies are speaking out more and more against its citizens avoiding the draft. Even though things are bad in Ukraine, people are more emotional there. Russia still controls a lot of eastern Ukraine, even though the army is very driven. President Volodymyr Zelensky has kept the country's faith alive, and the rest of the world has come to its defense. The AFU is still pushing back and has even taken back land, but progress has been slow and depends a lot on Western help. NATO and the US have given Ukraine a lot of high-tech weapons, but that won't last forever, especially since elections are coming up in many key allies. This makes a lot of people wonder how the war will end. That's what war and territory dispute expert Hein Goemans talked about on CNN. The University of Rochester professor talked about the possible ways the war could end, how likely each one was, and how hard it would be to end the conflict in any way. In short, don't expect victory parades anytime soon. One side was killed by decisive hits, and the other side then gave up without any conditions. It was the same during the U.S. Civil War, but that was a unique case because one of the sides wasn't even a country yet. Both sides will usually do anything to avoid a total loss. They may change their strategies, make a tactical retreat, or just keep the war at a low level forever. But sometimes neither side has a choice. Here are the things that one of the two sides in the Ukraine versus Russia war would have to do to actually win. We'll start with what most people thought would happen at the beginning of the war: a Russian success. This was possible in the early days of the war when Russia tried to surround and take over the capital city of Kyiv, catch Zelensky, or send him into exile and rule the country. Of the government of Ukraine within weeks, before NATO could come up with a solid answer. It almost happened. A massive advance of Russian troops from Belarus saw Kyiv nearly captured, but Ukraine pulled off a risky move by blowing a dam to flood Russian pontoon bridges, denying the Russians one of their access points. The war settled into a game of attrition, one that Ukraine has been winning thanks to NATO backing. But Putin hasn't given up. Russia has pulled off several surges since the early days of the war, sending large numbers of troops into Ukraine, to mixed effect. While they've taken some cities like the mining towns of Soledar, most are bombed-out areas in eastern Ukraine that are in the area Russia already controls. Russia also simply doesn't have the resources, either militarily or in terms of manpower, to overrun Ukraine anymore. That means that for Russia to pull off a total victory in the war, like Putin is promising, some major things need to change on the ground. But all of these options have some serious problems. Since the start of the war, Putin has been threatening to use nukes if NATO doesn't back off and let him have Ukraine. These threats are designed to scare the more dovish governments in the alliance into disengaging. But it doesn't seem to be working for several reasons. For one thing, no one thinks Putin, or more likely his generals, are foolish enough to a direct attack on NATO, so any nuclear attacks would probably be tactical and directed at Ukraine. This would only make Ukraine's allies more determined. The other big problem is that no one knows how many of Russia's nukes actually work. Most of them are old Cold War nukes that haven't been well taken care of since then. So Russia's so-called nuclear deterrent may just be a paper tiger. But Russia has other cards to play, even if they may be long shots. Russia's biggest problem in the war has been that it doesn't have many allies. Most of the world has either sided with Ukraine or stayed out of the conflict. Russia gets most of its weapons from China and North Korea, which see the war as a proxy conflict between the US and the opposition. This is because it's the only way for Russia to get equipment without breaking sanctions these past few months. But it's not enough to make a difference. That's why one ally could be the key. China has played a unique role in Russia's war so far, with Xi Jinping wasting no time. He put his arm around Vladimir Putin and said that their great powers were working together to fight the US. Since then, China has been very helpful to Russia while it's been under sanctions. It's one of Russia's biggest trading partners and has been very important in getting Russia supplies. Some analysts think that China wants Russia to win the war so that an age of conquest can begin, during which the international community will be less against China attacking Taiwan. A lot of people want to know why China isn't acting like they're all in. Even though Xi Jinping says he wants to help Russia, China has been hesitant in one major area. It has not given Russia any weapons, which is something it needs very badly. There could be more than one reason for this, but the most clear is that China is afraid of more sanctions from the West. China, on the other hand, has strong ties to the US in almost every area, especially technology. If China is hit with sanctions because of its role in the war in Ukraine, it could destroy the country's economy and cut it off from valuable resources. But there may be an even bigger reason. Russia looks like a loser right now, and China doesn't do business with losers. China was probably ready to give Russia what it needed. In a strange way, this means that Russia is less likely to attack when they need weapons the most. You should go after them. China is probably waiting for proof that Russia can win the war before getting more involved, since supporting a failed war could have worse effects than supporting a successful one. That means Russia has a lot of work to do before it can dream of a big victory parade in Moscow. One thing is that it will need friends, and China is at the top of the list. To win, Russia would have to weaken the government in Kyiv, which means it will have to. Russia doesn't have the weapons for a big attack right now, and China is probably the only country that can give them to them. So it might be able to coax China into taking the risk if it can show them a concrete plan, and that plan would likely start with two Eastern European countries. The first would be Belarus, where dictator Alexander Lukashenko is deep in debt to Putin. While Lukashenko's military is weak and wouldn't be of much help even if they helped in Ukraine, Putin would likely settle for access to the border to launch an offensive towards Kyiv from the north. But Ukraine has fended that off before, so another base is needed. Moldova is a small country that doesn't even border Russia, instead being sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania. But it might be the next flashpoint in Russia's expansionism. That's because Russia has sponsored a Russian separatist movement in the country's east, in a region called Transnistria. This slit of land borders Ukraine's south, and while Russia is using it to destabilize Moldova's pro-Western government, it might be more interested in the battalion of armed Russian troops stationed there, ostensibly to protect the pro-Russian population. That army could be used to launch a sneak attack on Ukraine, bringing Russian forces close to Kyiv from two directions. But would it be enough? In reality, it's possible, but not likely. For Putin's plan to work, everything would have to go perfectly. First, China would have to give him a clean bill of health when it comes to weapons. Next, the attack from both Belarus and Moldova would have to be hugely successful. It would work to surprise Ukraine and its NATO weapons, but the real goal is to attack Kyiv, capture Zelensky, or send him into exile, and set up a puppet government there to get Kyiv to give up. After that, Putin would make the latest crazy threat against NATO to keep them from getting involved, which is what the government in Ukraine wanted. Getting rid of them would be bad, impossible, and pretty much the only way for Putin to win for good in Ukraine without starting a much bigger war. But Russia is not likely to be able to pull it off. The main goals were to get civilians out of the country and persuade Zelensky to continue fighting from abroad. After the first few weeks, however, things started to look up, and people began to wonder if Ukraine could win. Does Ukraine really win? The answer seems to be yes, but it won't be easy. Russia controls less land than it did in the weeks after it invaded, is still fighting over bombed-out cities in the east, and has a high death toll that is cutting its military and supplies to the bone without a reliable supplier like Ukraine does. Because of this, Ukraine is becoming more brave, and they want to take back every inch of land Russia took from them. But the last mile is probably going to be the hardest. Right now, Ukraine has almost a blank check from the West. The US and the rest of NATO not only back their cause, but they also see this as a great chance. Some well-known people, including a certain former reality TV host, have complained about how much money is being spent on sending weapons to Ukraine. However, most Western countries support the country and are sending it everything from advanced anti-missile systems to cutting-edge technology. With a few big exceptions, most of the weapons Ukraine has been getting are designed for land combat and defense. This is one area where the West has been hesitant to meet Zelensky's requests. There are no fighter planes or long-range missiles because even though the West supports Kyiv, they don't want Zelensky to be able to escalate the conflict and directly attack Russia. That hasn't stopped Putin, though. A clearly staged drone attack on the Kremlin made Putin blame both Ukraine and the US and vow revenge. But right now, the West seems more interested in helping Ukraine fight off Putin than in helping it strike a decisive blow. In other words, Russia could react to a conventional attack with a nuclear one. The Kremlin has been quick to remind the West of this policy. Analysts aren't sure if Russia's nuclear arsenal is in good shape, or if Putin would actually use it, but they're not taking any chances. But Zelensky doesn't want to take over Russia, he just wants to get back land that Russia took, like the Crimean Peninsula that Russia took in 2014. In the past few months, Ukraine has become more daring, attacking arms stores across the border and supply bridges in Crimea, and this might be the end of going back. Putin took over Crimea with little resistance, other than condemnation from around the world because the government in Kyiv at the time was pro-Russia. Since then, he has officially claimed Crimea as part of Russia and says anyone trying to take it back would be attacking him. The West has been unwilling to support Ukraine's attempts to take it back, even though they still see it as part of Ukraine. However, Crimea is important for getting to the Black Sea and controlling the shipping lines in the area. Taking it back could be the closest thing Ukraine has to winning the war. What will be their plan going forward? Ukraine is likely to keep up a war of attrition, taking back cities as it can, and making Russia fight for every inch of land it doesn't have, even if it means sending troops and supplies they don't have and attacking key supply routes. This kind of war will cost Ukraine a lot, but they can keep it going much longer than Russia can. From there, they hope to launch a final offensive to push the Russians out of Crimea. And if Ukraine forces Russia out of the areas it has taken, he is not likely to retreat. Instead, he is likely to want to escalate the situation by hitting Ukraine with a barrage of rockets meant to kill as many civilians as possible. This may not work, but it can keep the war going forever. So, the only way this war could end with a Ukrainian victory is for Putin to die or be removed, most likely from natural causes, illness, or a Russian retirement plan. That includes his generals throwing him out of a fifth-floor window. After that, a new Russian leader might decide that Putin's foolishness isn't worth any more blood and treasure. War doesn't always end with a win, though. Is it time to give peace a chance? Now that the war has moved on to a new phase, people have only thought about one word: talks. Could they stop the war? A lot of people seem to agree, and there has been a lot of debate about it. To start, a group of about 30 progressive members of Congress put out an open letter, calling for the Biden administration to try to end the war through negotiations, but quickly took back the letter after being criticized for not showing enough support for a U.S. ally. While they were arguing about who was at fault for leaking the letter, an unlikely ally joined them: ultra-conservative Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who said that he would be more fair in his approach to ending the war if he became president. And it's not just U.S. voices in the mix. Was met with a lot of doubt, especially after a leaked plan showed that China's peace plan would split up Ukraine so that Russia would have a lot more of the country than it did now. However, these documents were never confirmed. The problem is that there might not be anything to negotiate over. Usually both sides start out on opposite ends of the table, and the goal is to bring them closer together. But some problems are just too big to solve, the person who is attacking them, not the other way around. And it seems like they have a new complaint every 2 weeks. At the same time, Ukraine's bargaining position is summed up in 2 words: Russia out. It's not always impossible to solve problems. This was the case with Israel and its many Arab enemies. Countries like Egypt and Jordan, which at first refused to even recognize Israel's existence, eventually signed peace deals and now work together with Israel on many important issues. On the other hand, talks with the Palestinian Authority have never ended because of important issues, such as whether millions of Palestinians related to those who fled to Israel in 1948 will be allowed to return. This means that even if Russia and Ukraine came to the negotiating table, there is no guarantee of success. Putin has made it clear that he is not ready to talk. However, Sergei Shoigu, who is the defense secretary and could become president in the future, might see this as a way to end a war that he didn't start and knows Russia can't win, even though Ukraine would never agree to give up. They might be persuaded to make some compromises, like giving up Crimea, which Russia has controlled for 9 years. On top of that, Russia may not want Ukraine as much as they want all sanctions lifted once the deal is signed. This could be a messy way to end the war, but it would need a reasonable Russian leader and a willing Ukraine, which doesn't seem likely. This means that the most likely way for the war in Ukraine to end is for it not to end. Like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many wars don't end in a neat way. The most famous example of this is probably the Korean Peninsula, where Western-aligned South Korea and isolated Communist North Korea have been at odds with each other.